All right, what we're going to be talking about the whole time today is protist. We've said 3 or 4 times already, and that this is wrong. That should say what? Eventually, I'll remember changing this. It should say eukaryotes. Protists are thought to be the first eukaryotes, and they're thought to have come about as a result of what? How do they think they came to be eukaryotes? Endosymbiosis, right? That prokaryotes began to live inside other prokaryotes. It worked out good for both of them, and they became so dependent on each other that eventually that's how we got organelles and eukaryotic cells. When we're talking about the protists, we're going to be talking about 2 kinds of things. Algae, which are more like plants, and protozoans, more like animals. The word protists is kind of an obsolete word, really, because the classification system today is based on what? What's the word? Phylogenetics, which means genetics and evolution. And as they've studied more and more about genetics, they figured out these things that we call protists. They're really not very closely related. So does it really make sense to keep them all in the same group? No. So they're starting to spread them out. The kingdom protista will eventually disappear from all the textbooks probably. But it's still a word that gets used, so we'll talk about it. They don't have a whole lot in common, these protists. The things that they have in common is most of the things we call protists are single-celled. There's some exceptions to that. And they're eukaryotic. That was a good hand right there. And that's about it in terms of what they have in common. Some of them can be autotrophic, like self-feeding, photosynthetic. Some are heterotrophic. There are a few that actually have more than one cell. Some of them have cell walls, some of them don't. So it's a varied group. The protozoan ones, the animal-like ones, are classified based on how they move, locomotion. And the algae classified based on the pigments, the proteins that collect light that they have. Realize that a lot of the algae, especially the multicellular ones today, are classified in the plant kingdom. A couple other things just off this side and general things. A lot of protists form what we call the phytoplankton, which is the bottom of the food chain, right? If that wasn't there, the oceans would die, literally. If you take that part though and you break it into pieces, phyto means what? Not like, nope, try again. Like a plant. And plankton are things that what? Float. So it's plant-like things that float on the surface of the water. I think last time I talked about 3 words related to water columns. Plankton are things that float on the top of the water. What are the things that swim, sort of like fish and dolphins and sharks and things like that? They're called nekton. And the things that live on the bottom, those are called benthic or benthos. Those are words that show up a lot. Just make sure you know what those mean. Thank you. And then another thing about algae is they can undergo blooms, which is when they grow like out of control, crazy. Cover up the top of the water. And generally they do that because of too much what in the water? Nitrogen or phosphorus. And how do those things tend to get in the water? Yeah, from fertilizer runoff from like fields, or maybe from like sewage systems from like big neighborhoods. So it's usually man-caused. Because normally there's not a lot of phosphorus and not a lot of nitrogen in the water. And there's said to be limiting factors because they limit what? Growth, they limit life. But all of a sudden, if there's a lot of those things in the water, these algae grow out of control. All right, for about the 100th time, here's another phylogenetic tree. This one, it didn't show up all that great, but this is a phylogenetic tree of just eukaryotes. There's a group for the plants, the animals, and the fungi. What eukaryotic group is not on there? Protists. Where would they be? Where would they be here? I would actually say probably right here would probably be a good place to start, because that's like the first ancestor of all these things, right? Right here, this would be a common ancestor between all of them too, so that can be a protist too. Here though, that's a common ancestor just between what? Fungi and animals. So know what a phylogenetic tree is about. It's an evolutionary family tree essentially, and at each branch, that's where the groups are splitting, and there's implied to be some kind of common ancestor sitting there. So who are you more related to as an animal? A plant or a fungus? Fungus, right? Share a closer common ancestor would be the idea. We talked about most of this already, stuff on this slide. These are the protozoan groups, the animal-like protists. The first group we mentioned, the Stegophora. These are things that move with a flagella, long tail-like structure. They are mostly heterotrophs. They have to eat. Some exceptions to that, but most of them are. They have those contractile vacuoles. What's the function of those things? Yeah, to get rid of water, because where do most of these things live? What kind of water? What kind of water? They're having water problems. Fresh water. Because if this, let's say this is a freshwater protist, and it's out here in pure water. From what we've been talking in class, how do we know water moves? High concentration of water, you can't get any higher than 100%, right? High concentration of water and a lower concentration of water. In terms of those tonic words, what kind of tonic? Hypo to hyper. Or in terms of solutes, where there's less solute to where there's more solute. Water's going to go in. And these protists, if they don't have a way to deal with that, they're going to explode. They're going to burst, lyse. So they have these vacuoles that collect the water and then just pump it out. Most of them reproduce asexually through something sort of like binary fission. The two examples that we talked about last time were Giardia, which tend to live where? In freshwater streams and stuff. That's why you don't want to drink that water without purifying it, because if you do, what might happen? You were out hiking in Gatlinburg and you started drinking out of one of those streams there, what might happen? Get really bad diarrhea. It's like camper's diarrhea from this thing. Trypanosomes are a lot more scary. These things are transmitted through the bite of a fly. It's called the tsetse fly. And once they get into you, they cause what? A scary sounding disease. Maybe we didn't mention this last time. African sleeping sickness, which basically means you go into a coma that you may not ever wake up from, just from an insect bite. That's scary. The next group down is a group called ciliata, and these move with cilia, which are shorter than flagella, usually more numerous. The cilia not only help them to move, but they also help them to sweep food into their mouth-like opening. And I've got a video that you'll see on that in a second. They too have the contractile vacuoles to get rid of water, because they're freshwater things mostly. They can conjugate. What does conjugate mean? Yeah, hook together. They're eukaryotes, so they don't really have plasmids, but they switch DNA, sort of like sex, to give them some variation. But typically, they reproduce in a more asexual way. But they can do conjugation to get some variation. The paramecium is by far the most famous member of this group. Got a picture of another one I'll show you also called the stentor. The third group is called Sarcodina, or Sarcodina. These are the amoebas mostly, which you've heard a lot about, I'm sure. Got a video that shows you an amoeba moving, and it also shows it eating here in a second. But they move with pseudopods, which literally that means what? False foot. Basically, they're sort of like a blob, and they'll stick out a piece and then just sort of flow toward it. They're real liquidy like. But they eat by phagocytosis. What does that word literally mean? You break it into pieces. What's cyto mean? Cell. And phago means to eat. So cell eating. Essentially, they'll surround something and pull it in and put it in a vacuole. And then how do they digest it? Using the lysosomes. What do we call that kind of digestion? Intracellular. So they'll phagocytize it and then do intracellular digestion. They usually reproduce asexually. Got the contractile vacuoles. There's some species in this group that put shells around themselves. And the shells tend to be made out of silica, which is sort of like glass, or calcium carbonate, like chalk, limestone kinds of stuff. And I'll show you pictures of those too. There's a couple of kinds of amoebas that can cause serious infections. One of them is called dysentery, or amoebic dysentery. When would you be likely to get dysentery? Yeah, when you're drinking water that's not purified very well. Mostly like in maybe parts of Mexico, Africa, Asia. Don't tend to worry about it here too much unless what's might be going on. When are you ever talking about dysentery in the United States? Well, yeah, back then, true, but I mean now, today. Yeah, today. The only time I've heard it mentioned lately is like during real bad disasters, like Hurricane Katrina, when what got flooded. Yeah, well, the water treatment facilities all got flooded down here in New Orleans. So if you were drinking out of the tap, which I don't know if the taps were even working, but if you were drinking out of the tap, you were drinking water that wasn't purified. It had sewage and all kinds of stuff in it because it was all flooded together. That's when you might get dysentery because it's really, really bad diarrhea. And we hear that in the United States. We don't think that's very serious. But diarrhea kills a lot of people. A lot of places in the world you can't just go to the hospital and get an IV, or take a pill that will keep you from dying. So dysentery is serious. And then something else that's pretty serious, really serious, and kind of scary. Lately in Alabama, there's been 2 infections by this thing called the brain-eating amoeba. How does it get into you? Yeah, it's swimming in like a lake or a pond. It comes in through your nose, goes into your brain, starts feeding on your brain. That's scary. Kind of scary. The last one of these protozoan groups that we'll talk about is called sporozoa. These things do not move on their own. They don't have any organs for moving. But they're thought to be the most advanced evolutionarily. And the reason for that is they've got this complicated life cycle where they live in multiple hosts. And the hosts actually move them around so they don't have to move. By far the famous one of these is this thing right here, Plasmodium. And this is the protist that causes what famous disease? What's probably the most famous protist-caused disease? It's one of the most common infections in the world. Not in the United States. Malaria. Caused by this thing, transmitted how? By mosquitoes. And does this thing hurt the mosquito that it's living in? No. Where does it live in the mosquito? It lives in its salivary glands. And that makes a lot of sense, because when a mosquito bites you, what's the first thing it does? It spits on you. What's in the spit? Chemical to numb you so you don't feel it, and a chemical to keep what from happening. What does the mosquito not want to happen when it's biting on you? Your blood to clot. So it puts a drug in you to keep your blood from clotting, and one to keep you from feeling that it's there. Yeah.
So if you like cut your finger, like right after a mosquito bit you,
It's really local, so no, it's not enough. It's really a local, small dose. But what these germs do is when they come in through that mosquito bite, they go to your liver. And that's where they start to reproduce. They burst out of your liver and get into your bloodstream and start feeding on away. No, not quite. They feed on your red blood cells, which very quickly means you start feeling how? Weak. Because what's the job of your red blood cells? To carry oxygen. So if you don't have enough oxygen, you can't do enough cell respiration, and therefore you don't have enough ATP, and therefore you can't do enough of anything, because that's what powers everything in your body. Malaria can be really, really deadly. Why don't we have malaria here? Have we had malaria in the United States? Yeah. Why don't we have it now? Because we killed all the mosquitoes that caused it with wet poison mostly. This big famous poison that everybody thinks is a really awful thing. Yeah, but there's like a famous example of that, the one that everybody hears about. And we'll talk about it in a minute in a bad way. This is a good way. DDT, you guys heard of DDT? Most famous poison of all time, probably. Really deadly. We use it to kill off millions of mosquitoes. We don't have malaria anymore in the United States. But it caused some problems. Lots of problems. Where was most of the DDT in the world made? Redstone arsenal? That's what I don't know. And that caused some problems out near their arsenal in some communities where there's still poison lingering all over the place. Let's look at a couple of things here. I think this is going to be a little video clip if it works. I don't think my recording will like that, so I'm going to pause the recording for a second. Back up. So here's an amoeba. We saw in the video the pseudopods, how that they extend this little fake foot and then they basically flow toward it. But you can also see in this picture that it's definitely a eukaryotic cell. It's got mitochondria, it's got little vesicles and vacuoles, it's got a nucleus with a nucleolus there in the middle. There's that contractile vacuole that helps it get rid of water. So it's got all the parts that make it be a eukaryote. There's one of the amoeba family organisms that make shells. This one's made out of calcium carbonate, like limestone. This one's made out of glass. Kind of a cool looking shell. There's a paramecium, ciliate. And again, notice all the cilia, and notice the organelles. Contractile vacuole for getting rid of water. There's that little oral groove and mouth opening where it puts vesicles around things. There's the nucleus. There's another one of those contractile vacuoles. You can't see the mitochondria in this picture, but they have them. There are two paramecium conjugating. So they're swapping DNA, creating genetic variability in that picture. And this is another kind of cilia. This is a stentor. He usually is going to stick himself to some kind of surface down here, and then he's going to use these cilia to pull in some food. And for some reason that picture's in German. I don't know why I chose a German picture. This is the plasmodium. This is the one that causes malaria. And you can see it's showing you that the things live in the salivary glands of the mosquito. They get injected through the bite, go into the liver, mature, reproduce, come out and start eating your red blood cells. Not a pretty picture.
Like, if you have malaria, are you basically a test and it's going to do anything?
No, there's treatments. There's treatments for malaria. All right, the last couple of pictures. This is the thing. This is a trypanosome. That's the one that causes the African sleeping sickness. This one over here is actually kind of a good one. Not so much for us, but for the thing it lives in. This one lives in termite guts. And what does it do for the termite? Breaks down the cellulose. And that's a good example of mutualism. This thing can only live in termite guts. And termite guts can't live without it. It's an important deal for both of them. All right, let me back up now. The other thing that we got to talk about, and the last thing we'll talk about today, are the algae. And we're only going to discuss three groups. of algae. There are a lot of other groups. We're going to talk about 3. Remember, they're grouped based on the pigments they have. The first group we'll talk about is a phylum called Chrysophyta. And remember, this means plant-like, phyta. So these are actually golden plant-like things. We call them the golden algae. They have this pigment in them called fucoxanthin, which is sort of a brownish yellow color. What I want you to know about these things are 2 things. First of all, these are the major producers in the oceans. They are the bottom of the food chain in the oceans. If these weren't there, the oceans would probably die in terms of the life in the oceans. They're the most important photosynthetic organism in the oceans. And they've got these cool little shells made of silica, which we said a minute ago is what? Glass. They're very tiny. The best example of one of these things is a little organism called a diatom, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. These little shells, when you look at like sand, you see all those little glassy particles in the sand? That's what you look at. So when you use your toothpaste and you feel that gritty stuff in your toothpaste, dead bodies of diatoms. That's what that gritty stuff is, used to scrub your teeth with. It's called diatomaceous earth. So let me show you a picture first. These are diatoms. Or here. These are diatoms here. So it's got a glassy-like shell. It's kind of yellowish, but it's also got some green in there. It can do photosynthesis. The next group we'll mention is called Pyrophyta. So that literally means fiery plants. Fire algae is what we call them. They're single-celled photosynthesizers. Also important in the food chain, down there at the bottom of the food chain, they're producers. If they have a cell wall, which some of them don't, it's made of cellulose, so it's a lot like the cell walls in plants. But there's some cool things about these guys. Why they're called fire algae is they can do bioluminescence.
Oh, are those the things that like you see like when you go like to a tropical place and then like you put your paddle out and then it lights
The
up?
water glows. They can glow. And I mean, think about it. If you were 100 years ago, before we knew what this was, you're in your boat, and all of a sudden you look down and the water's glowing. It's pretty scary. But they can make the water get very bright. And they're pretty common down even like on the Brown Belt shores. It's not that uncommon. Maybe the most famous example of a fire algae is this thing called a dinoflagellate. These things can reproduce and cause what's called a red tide. You guys heard of red tides before? So it's an algal bloom of this particular kind of algae. They're reddish colored, so it makes the water look blood red almost. And it's dangerous because these things make a poison. It's a pretty toxic poison. And what do you see floating all over the water when you have a red tide? Dead fish. Still fish. But something that it doesn't kill are things like clams and oysters. How do clams and oysters tend to eat? What does a clam eat? It filters the water. So the clams and oysters are eating these things. But the poison doesn't hurt them. But where did the poison stay? In them. Each one of these little dinoflagellates only has a little bit of poison. But how many of these things do you think a clam or oyster might eat? Full of life. And all that poison gets dissolved in the fat of the clam or oyster, so it stays in the body. So what happens to the amount of poison in the clam or the oyster? It gets higher. And if you were to eat a clam or oyster that came from one of these areas, what would happen? You would die very quickly. It was called paralytic shellfish poisoning. So one of the jobs of the Coast Guard is to monitor where these things are happening and to block fishing in that area for a long time after this to protect people. I mentioned something there a second ago with the poison. Poisons tend to build up in things as you go up the food chain. And that's called biological magnification or bioaccumulation. I mentioned DDT a minute ago. DDT was first used to do what? What are most poisons used to do? What are we trying to kill? Insects, mostly, right? That's what it was for. What happened with the insects in DDT though pretty quickly? A lot of them became resistant. Why can things like insects evolve to get resistance really fast? Bacteria and insects, they evolve faster than anything in the world. How come? They have short life cycles. And every time they reproduce, there's a chance of what can happen. Mutations that can cause evolution. So that's where new genes come from, is from mutations. So things that with really short life cycles can evolve fast. What things ended up getting hurt the most by DDT? Not the insects, but one a little bit higher up the food chain. Fish. A lot of places like the Flint River around here, when DDT got banned somewhere in the late 60s. When I was a little kid, I was born in 71. When I was a little kid, if you tried to fish on the Flint River, guess what? You'd never catch a fish on the Flint River. Because DDT had been sprayed so much in this area that it killed off almost all the fish in the river. But today, since DDT's been banned, today you go out, how many of you canoed the Flint River before? Well, there's fish all over the place. They're coming back. But the fish got hurt because of this bioaccumulation thing. Whatever they were eating, whether it was insects or smaller fish, had a little bit of toxin. But every time they ate one of those things, what happened to the fish? They got more, and it stayed in their body, and the toxin just kept building up and building up and building up. But other than fish, what's the most famous thing that got hurt by the DDT? Birds. Specifically, what bird almost went extinct because of it? If you're an American, you ought to know about this bird. Bald eagle. Bald eagles didn't almost go extinct because people were out shooting them. They went extinct because they were eating fish, right? That had been eating bugs or smaller fish. So what was the toxin like in these fish? It was high. And the toxin didn't kill the bald eagle. Anybody know what it did to them? It made the shells of their eggs really, really thin. So that before the babies were ready, the shell broke. So it kept them from reproducing. And they almost went extinct. But back, like I said, in the late 60s, whenever it was we banned DDT, what's happened since? The bald eagles. Coming back. You can find them nesting on the Flint River here. You can go to Gunnersville Lake, and you can actually go on a guided tour of Gunnersville Lake, and they'll show you all these bald eagle nests down here. They're coming back because the DDT's gone. But make sure you know what biological magnification is, and I got an extra I in there. That shouldn't be there. It's when the amount of toxin tends to build up as you go up the food chain, because most toxins are fat soluble. They tend to get stored in the fat within the bodies. All right, the last group we will mention today is a little group called Euglenophyta. Most of you probably heard of Euglena before. And I'll show you some pictures. But these are cool because they're sort of like in the middle between a plant and an animal. They have chlorophyll, just like a plant. And as long as there's light, they do photosynthesis. But if you turn off the lights, what starts to happen? Well, everything does their respiration, plant and animal. But they start eating. And they'll eat each other, they'll eat other things. So they can go from being photosynthetic to heterotrophic. They've got this little red eye spot. They can't really see. What's the eye spot there for? If you were photosynthetic and you could move, it would make sense you would have an eye spot, because where do you want to be? Toward the light, right? It tells them where to go, which way to go to get to the light. They are mostly fresh water. So they have contractile vacuoles to help get rid of the water. Let me show you a couple pictures. Again, there's the diatom, bottom of the food chain in the oceans. So these are the dinoflagellates, the ones that cause the red tides. Here's a euglena. Notice it's green. It's got a lot of chlorophyll. It can do photosynthesis. Got a flagella. The little eye spot doesn't show up very good on this with this projector, but it's usually kind of a bright red spot right in there. It's got all kinds of organelles. Remember that it can do photosynthesis when there's light. It can eat when it's dark. Pretty cool thing. And that is a good place for us to stop. We get there a little early today.